The village of Hollybrook lay nestled among frost-silvered hedgerows, its thatched cottages wearing a light dusting of snow like sugar on a Christmas cake. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, church bells chimed in distant rehearsal, and every window glowed with the promise of mulled wine and seasonal goodwill. To an outsider, Hollybrook appeared the very picture of peace. Miss Jane Marple, however, had long learned that such perfection often concealed the most unfortunate disturbances. She sat in the drawing-room of Greystone Manor, her knitting resting idle in her lap, observing without appearing to do so. The manor belonged to Colonel Arthur Pembroke, a stiff-backed gentleman of precise habits and considerable pride. Each Christmas, he invited a select gathering of relatives, acquaintances, and local worthies to stay for the holiday. This year was no exception. Miss Marple had been invited at the personal request of Emily Harcourt, the Colonel's widowed sister, who insisted that Christmas without a sensible companion was quite unthinkable. Miss Marple had accepted, knowing full well that a house full of people at Christmas was rather like a simmering pudding, pleasant enough until something boiled over. The guests were an assorted lot. Clara Pembroke, the Colonel's niece, was a striking woman in her early 30s, elegant and sharp-eyed, with a manner that suggested she had learned to rely on herself alone. She had recently returned from London under vague circumstances. Gerald Whitcomb, the Colonel's secretary, was a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and a habit of adjusting his spectacles when flustered, which was often. Mrs. Beatrice Snow, a long-time family friend and self-appointed moral authority of the village, possessed a voice that could carry across a crowded church hall and opinions to match. And finally, there was Dr. Leonard Finch, the village physician, genial, broad-shouldered, and widely trusted, perhaps too widely, Miss Marple thought, watching the ease with which he moved among the guests. Christmas Eve arrived with a flurry of activity. Holly boughs adorned the banisters, a magnificent goose roasted in the kitchen, and the scent of nutmeg and cloves hung heavily in the air. Tea was served promptly at 4, as was the Colonel's custom. It was during this tea that the first shadow fell. Colonel Pembroke, seated at the head of the table, complained mildly of a bitter taste in his cup. Mrs. Snow laughed it off. Tea, she said, was never quite right when brewed in unfamiliar pots. The Colonel drank it nonetheless. Less than an hour later, he was found slumped in his study chair, eyes closed, breathing shallow and laboured. Dr. Finch was summoned at once, but there was little to be done. By the time the church bells rang 6, Colonel Arthur Pembroke was dead. The doctor pronounced it heart failure tragic, but not unexpected in a man of his age. Yet Miss Marple, standing quietly in the corner, noticed several things that unsettled her. The teacup had been removed and washed with unusual haste. Clara Pembroke's face showed no grief, only calculation, and Gerald Whitcomb looked as though he might faint at any moment. As the household gathered in shocked silence, snow began to fall more heavily outside, sealing Greystone Manor off from the village below. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. "It is so very sad," she murmured gently, "how Christmas brings out the truth in people, whether they wish it or not." By Christmas morning, Hollybrook buzzed with restrained excitement. Death, particularly at Greystone Manor, was irresistible to village speculation. Yet official investigation was delayed, the roads were impassable, and the local inspector could not arrive until the following day. Miss Marple considered this a blessing. She began, as she always did, with conversation. At breakfast, Clara Pembroke spoke briskly of returning to London at once. She explained, little attachment to Greystone Manor, and found prolonged mourning uncomfortable. Miss Marple noted this carefully. People who speak too quickly often do so to avoid hearing their own thoughts. Gerald Whitcomb lingered after breakfast, nervously rearranging papers in the study. When Miss Marple asked how long he had served the Colonel, he answered promptly 6 years, but avoided her gaze. "He was very particular," Gerald said. "Demanded loyalty." "Yes," Miss Marple replied mildly. "That sort of thing does encourage resentment." Mrs. Snow, cornered in the parlour, was full of righteous sorrow. She lamented the moral decay of the younger generation, hinted darkly at secrets within the family, and insisted that Colonel Pembroke had intended to change his will. That remark caught Miss Marple's attention. Later she took a short walk with Dr. Finch, who spoke warmly of the Colonel's health. No warning signs, no complaints. His death, the doctor insisted, was sudden but natural. "Heart trouble can strike without notice," he said cheerfully. "So can poisoning. Miss Marple replied gently. Dr. Finch laughed, but there was a flicker in his eyes she did not miss. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the kitchen, where the cook reluctantly admitted that only one person had served tea the previous evening, Gerald Whitcomb. But the tray passed through several hands, the cook added quickly. Indeed, Miss Marple retired to her room and reflected. The Colonel's death had been convenient for several people: Clara, who stood to inherit; Gerald, whose loyalty may have been strained; Mrs. Snow, who had long been humiliated by the Colonel's dismissive manner; and Dr. Finch, who had access. She thought of a girl in St. Mary Mead who had once poisoned her aunt by slipping something into elderberry wine. Nothing dramatic, just enough to weaken the heart. It is always the quiet methods, Miss Marple murmured, that prove the most effective. On Boxing Day morning, another disturbance occurred. Gerald Whitcomb failed to appear for breakfast. He was found shortly after in the garden, having slipped on the icy path and struck his head. He was alive, but unconscious. Dr. Finch pronounced it an accident. Miss Marple did not like accidents. In Gerald's room, she noticed papers missing from his desk. The Colonel's will, perhaps, or something else entirely. When Gerald regained consciousness later that day, he was agitated and frightened. "I didn't do it," he whispered hoarsely to Miss Marple. "I swear I didn't poison him." "Of course not," she said calmly. "You are not the sort." That seemed to comfort him more than any denial. Clara Pembroke, meanwhile, had grown increasingly impatient. She demanded to know when the police would arrive and complained bitterly of being trapped. Miss Marple observed her sharp exchanges with Mrs. Snow, who hinted broadly that Clara's return from London had not been entirely respectable. Dr. Finch remained the voice of reason, helpful, soothing, always available. Too available, Miss Marple thought. He had attended the Colonel frequently in recent months. A visit to the village chemist revealed something interesting. Dr. Finch had recently purchased a mild digitalis preparation, perfectly legal, perfectly dangerous in excess. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the teacup. Christmas, she reflected, had a way of encouraging people to take risks they might otherwise avoid. When the inspector finally arrived, Miss Marple requested a private conversation. She laid out her observations calmly, without drama. The Colonel had intended to revise his will, cutting off Clara, dismissing Gerald, and donating much of his estate to village causes overseen by Mrs. Snow. Only one person knew all this: Dr. Finch. The doctor had been prescribing mild medication, gradually weakening the Colonel's heart. On Christmas Eve, he arranged matters so that Gerald served the tea, ensuring suspicion fell elsewhere, while the final dose had already been administered earlier that day. Gerald's accident was no accident at all. He had discovered the truth and been silenced. When confronted, Dr. Finch broke down. Years of financial difficulty, resentment at the Colonel's condescension, and the temptation of control had proved too much. "I only meant to frighten him," he said weakly. "But it went too far." Miss Marple regarded him sadly. "That is what everyone says," she replied. Dr. Finch was taken away quietly, the snow falling softly once more. Gerald Whitcomb recovered fully and was exonerated. Clara Pembroke departed for London subdued and thoughtful. Mrs. Snow found herself strangely silent. Greystone Manor returned to its usual calm, though Christmas would never quite be the same. On her final morning, Miss Marple stood by the window, watching villagers make their way to church. So much trouble, she reflected, all because people forget that kindness costs nothing, and cruelty always charges interest. She picked up her knitting and smiled faintly. Christmas, after all, was meant for peace. And Hollybrook, for the moment, had found it once more.